We are. We're streaming. Yeah, but you wouldn't get to ask me questions. So if you're here, because I am going to try and leave some time at the end, I'm sure I'm going to prompt some questions. So I'm going to do my best to answer them. So welcome. A lot of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Rob Shearer. I'm a member here at this church. I'm also the director of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center, which was founded about 20 years ago. And its goal is to, let's see here, I can actually put it up. I got a slide. Founded to promote biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. And it's named for the influential theologian and apologist Francis Schaeffer, 1912, 1984. Some of you may know him. He did a film series called How Then Shall We Live, along with a number of other books. The God Who Is There, He Is There, and He Is Not Silent, Escape from Reason. He was very influential in the late 60s and 70s, and had a profound impact on my life. I had a pastor in Atlanta who handed me a book by Schaeffer to read, and it really sort of revolutionized my idea about how you should approach the Bible. Schaeffer was big on, all truth is God's truth. He had a ministry to university students in Europe. He and his family had bought a chalet in Switzerland, and students would come on their weekends and holidays, and he would have roundtable discussions, and they would present papers, and he would answer questions. He'd bring in guest lecturers. Once a year, he packed up everybody at the chalets, then went down to Italy to spend time in the art museums in Florence and Rome. So I do a little bit of that too. I've done that every other year for the past 20 years. I take students to Italy and Germany, and interested friends. So let me pray for us, and then I'll get started. So, Father, thank you for an opportunity to gather on a Tuesday night and to think about history and think about how it fits together and what the big picture really means, and how that should shape the way we approach the events of our own time. I pray you would send your Spirit, that the things that I say would be useful and true, helpful and insightful, that folks would have their questions answered, and that they'd be stirred up to remember that you are the God of history, you are the God who acts in history, and you are not done acting in history. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, that's a little more. If you are interested in the Schaeffer Study Center, there's a brochure out in the lobby that you can pick up. I won't really spend any time on that. For those of you that don't know me, yes, I've been married for 47 years. My long-suffering wife is back in the back somewhere. She's prepping for our elementary school program. My daughter has just slipped in on the back row there, one of my daughters. I have 3 sons and 9 daughters, and currently 19 grandchildren and 2 more on the way. Probably more relevant to what we're doing tonight, I'm a historian. My undergraduate degree is from Davidson College in North Carolina. I have a graduate degree from Stanford University on the left coast. And at both of those schools, I had the great blessing of being given the opportunity to enroll in a great books program. So in my undergraduate degree, I did a 2-year walk through Western history. We started when I was a freshman with the Epic of Gilgamesh in the first week, and we finished 2 years later with Jean-Paul Sartre. And I got to Stanford and was starting my PhD coursework, and discovered they offered a joint doctorate in history and humanities, and you enrolled in a seminar that started with the Epic of Gilgamesh and finished 2 years later with Jean-Paul Sartre. And I was like, where do I sign up? This is great. So I loved both, and it really sort of shaped my approach to history. I've been a bunch of other things, probably not too relevant to tonight, but yeah, that's me. And that's me. The wall behind me is the Vatican in Rome. So I actually threw the topic into an AI image generator, and this is what it threw back. I'm not sure whether I like it or not, but it's interesting. I'm very interested in AI. All right. Here's how most of us were taught history, including me. In elementary school and high school, I went through the public school system in Atlanta, Georgia, which was not the worst public school system in the country. I don't know that it was the best, but I don't think it was the worst. And every year we would start the school year, and in the fall, because of Thanksgiving, we would do a unit on the Pilgrims. And then after we came back from Christmas break, we'd have President's Day, so we'd talk about Washington and Lincoln. And then we'd do something else, I forget. And we'd come back, and in second grade, we came back, and in the fall, because we had Thanksgiving coming up, we did a unit on the Pilgrims. And after Christmas break, we did Washington and Lincoln because we had President's Day. And we did that for 6 out of 7 years in elementary school. One year, I've forgotten whether it was 5th or 6th grade, but one of those years, instead of doing the Pilgrims and the Presidents, we did Western history in 1 year. And I had all kinds of holes and gaps. I don't think we ever finished that textbook, by the way. Same thing happened to me in high school, although my high school was even more hit and miss. So how I was taught history was a real problem. I couldn't actually connect one era to another. I didn't know how we got from the pyramids to the Colosseum to, I remember reading the Old Testament, and they were conquered by the Babylonians, and then you turned a page, and there was a Roman governor, and they were all speaking Greek. I'm going, what happened? There's 500 years there that nobody ever talked about. So how we were all taught history in my generation left us with a lot of gaps. I don't think it's gotten better. There's also a possible problem with who they were delegating the teaching of history to. I actually think there have been 4 disastrous substitutions in the way in which history is taught. Unfortunately, it's not confined to the public schools, although it's certainly prevalent there. Even the private schools go through this. We've substituted world history for Western history. I don't really object to the study of world history. I've gotten interested in it. We have 2 daughters that we adopted from China, and I got real interested in going back and learning Chinese history. I think it's very valuable, and I think everybody ought to know the history of their culture. But for some reason, people think every group of people ought to know the history of their culture, and we ought to honor their choices, except for us, because Western history is nothing but miserable oppression of the privileged class, of the underprivileged class. I'm going, why don't we get to have some pride in our history as well? And then it's not always true that the dominance of Western civilization has been a good thing. Not all of the choices and actions have been commendable. But it is true that Western history has dominated the globe from ancient to modern. The Western world became the dominant world culture. So that substitution was not a good one. And then we went further and we substituted social studies for history. And social studies drives me crazy. Social studies is, they work on a concentric model. So we're going to talk about, let's talk about our community. And then let's talk about our state. And then let's talk about the United States and North America. And then and the problem with that is the unspoken lesson is, hello there, boys and girls, we're living in the center of the world. And that's not true either. You miss the connections, the long conversation over time that has shaped who we are and the culture we live. We substituted textbooks for living books. This is a pet peeve of mine. Especially Western civilization textbooks are just death on toast. They are deadly dull. They want to talk about trends and economics and coinage and iconography and occasionally a map they're thrown in, and it's like your eyes roll back and glaze over. Kids love stories. If you can tell a good story, then not only are kids' interest captured, but they'll remember what that story was. I dare say, if I asked anybody in the room, do you remember a textbook that you used in elementary school? I remember some colors. I even remember sort of the smell, and we used to do the grocery store bag, covers for your textbooks. You'd turn it in. I couldn't tell you anything I learned out of a textbook. I'll ask another question, though. How many of you have a favorite book from your childhood? Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel. I can probably recite most of the text. I can even, if you press me, I could probably do Captain Kangaroo's voice reading it. So why are we using the books that everybody hates and we're not using the books that kids love? Because there are good biographies, there are good stories out there. And we've substituted the good, the enchanting, the interesting, the memorable with a mess of pottage. And then the other thing that happened is we substituted football coaches for history teachers. And I don't know why this is true or whose plan this was. I just know that it happened. And I was taught history by football coaches, and they were terrible. I'm sorry. Well, I'll take it back. There was one example. I had one football coach who was really, really good. He taught a government class where we compared the U.S. Constitution with the Soviet Constitution, and he knew it, and he made it interesting. But the other guys, they were diagramming the plays for the practice in the afternoon, and they'd put something up on the board and tell us to read a chapter and do the homework. Anyway, this is why we have a bad taste in our mouths, and this is why most of us don't know history very well. So I understand there are all sorts of good reasons. I want to give you a visual. Miss Joy, can I borrow you? This is a great book. And Chris, actually, can I get you to come out and help? And Yvette, could you come up and help me? Because I'm going to need 3. Yeah, okay, hold on. Well, I'll come this way a little bit.
I want this book.
It's called The Wall Chart of World History. It goes in and out of print. The original is actually from 1800. This one is a reprint, and it's added on. So it goes from Adam to Ronald Reagan. Now, I don't know if there's any philosophical or theological lesson in the two choices of the endpoints, but I'm not buying a new one. I kind of like Adam to Ronald Reagan. Anyway, let me just, I won't go through all the detail on this because this is not the best way to get the big picture, but it is fun to illustrate one thing. So here's Adam and all the names from the book of Genesis. Here's Methuselah and his son Lamech. And Methuselah, of course, has this big old long lifespan. These little black markers are centuries. That's 100 years. So here's Methuselah, and he lives right here. And look at right here. There's this black spike comes in from the top because Methuselah dies the year of the flood. So here's the flood and the Tower of Babel. And then springing out of the Tower of Babel, here's the history of Israel on the top. And here are all the various streams of all the various descendants of Noah and his 3 sons. And I won't talk about all of this. Here's Babylon, here's Egypt, here's actually the sojourn in Egypt and the Exodus, here's the history of Israel. Here comes, there's a big green swath here that swallows up some other streams, which is the Persian Empire. Ancient Persia is modern Iran. They're not Arab, they're Persian, different language, different history. And it comes to a screeching halt. It runs up against this big red spike that's starting down here at the stream that's labeled Greece. And that big red spike is Alexander the Great. Because when you talk about Alexander the Great conquered the world, what Alexander the Great conquered was the Persian Empire. He went east. He went into the Persian Empire and went all the way to India. So that's why he crosses all of that. And then, of course, nothing lasting comes out of his conquests. It immediately splinters into 4 different streams. And then coming out here at the bottom is the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire. And here's the life of Jesus, right here when the Roman Empire is at its almost largest sway. And then the Roman Empire falls apart, and you get a whole bunch of little countries all the provinces of the Roman Empire go their separate ways and become the countries of Europe and North Africa. So we can see, Scotland and Italy and France and Germany. And here are the kings of the Middle Ages. Here's England and Scotland. Some of these longer blocks. Here's Edward III, Henry VI. Here's Henry VIII and Elizabeth. These two red blocks right here, Henry VIII and Elizabeth. Now, one of the reasons I really like this timeline is it uses the same scale for the years from beginning to end. So 100 years back here is exactly the same distance as 100 years down here. So we've got Henry VIII and Elizabeth, and then we've got the Stuarts, Charles I, Charles II, and guess what? Springing out of the strain of English history, here's a familiar name, George III, Mad King George. And springing out of George III block is another little stream up here with a whole bunch of little tiny colored blocks, because the presidents of the United States do not rule for more than 8 years. So here is all of the history of the United States of America from George Washington to Ronald Reagan. So I'll go back to my little summary of what happened to us in elementary school. We spend 6 years studying this, and this cheats actually. They doubled the scale on the last century. It really should end about here. So we spend 6 years studying that. And then 1 year we tip our hat and go, let's do everything else. From Adam down to George Washington. Okay, we'll come back to this. Thank you, my lovely assistants. You too, Chris. Oh. Yeah, I highly recommend timelines for teaching students. I bring this out every year with my high school students, and we talk about where are we on the timeline and what's going on, because it shows you how they're all related. So you can see here, here's the whole timeline on the top, and here's that first little segment blown up. I won't spend a lot of time going through this, but you can see sort of what's going on. So I promised you I'd give you the big picture. And traditionally, Western civilization divided up into 3 main periods. Let me get my left and right here. Ancient, medieval, modern. So ancient, I don't know, it's hard to pick a date for the beginning of it, but let's go with 4000 BC. We don't have any written records any older than that, by the way. We have a few things from Egypt that go from about 3500. The Chinese claim they have lists of Chinese kings that go back past 4000. They don't, they're made up. The Egyptians have some long lists of pharaohs that they would say you could trace back. No. We sort of know when Egypt became a united country, and it's about 2500 BC. So Egypt gets together about here. The ancient world then, in the big picture, lasts from, call it 4000 BC, whether you want to talk about that as Adam, or whether you want to talk about that as the flood, or whether you want to talk about that as the Tower of Babel. That's probably, give or take, 500 years. That's roughly what we're talking about. And the ancient world lasts up to about 500 AD. Everybody marks the end of the ancient world with the collapse of Rome. So from Adam, Noah, Babel, to the fall of Rome, we got 4,500 years. Well, written records probably more like about 3,000. Abraham, by the way, who's really a historical person, probably about 2,500 BC. Moses, probably about 1,500 BC. King David, better than probably. We can get within about 10 years. King David, probably about 1,000 BC. 1,020 to 950 for sure are his dates. The conquest of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar and the taking of the Jews into exile in Babylon, that's 570 BC, and we know that. We've got a good solid date for that. There's no relay, maybe a year or two in different chronologies, but that's it. We get to the Roman Empire, we have even better records. We know Julius Caesar's dates, down to the exact numerical year. Caesar is assassinated in 44 BC, and it's not 45 and it's not 43, it's 44. We know that. Jesus gets a little tricky because the historians, the medieval historians who first tried to calculate when was Jesus born, got the dates wrong. They got the dates wrong for Herod, and they got the dates wrong for... So Jesus is actually probably not born in 1 AD. There is no year zero, by the way. It goes from 1 BC to 1 AD. He's probably born 4 years before. He's probably born in 4 BC, probably, because that's when we know Herod was still ruling. The Roman Empire comes to an end then about 500 years later. So from Jesus to the last emperor is 500 years. And then we get the Middle Ages. By the way, they didn't know they were living in the Middle Ages. They didn't call their own time period the Middle Ages. Mostly for a long time, they thought they were still living in the Roman world. They thought of themselves as being the direct descendants of and longing for a revival of the central government of ancient Rome. The German emperors in the Middle Ages all claimed the title emperor, and they all claimed the territory of Italy, and they all wanted to go to Rome to be coronated. Not just once or twice, but every Roman emperor through the Middle Ages always scheduled a coronation in Rome. And they ruled. Sometimes, almost always the northern part of Italy, and they were always wanted to get the rest of Italy as well, and once or twice it happened. So the Middle Ages thought they were living in the continuation of the Roman Empire. It wasn't until you get to about 1400, 1500 that some of the writers look around. And actually, the Renaissance is a literary movement. We think of the Renaissance as great art, but the artists are sort of a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. The artists didn't change the style of their art first, and then everybody else caught on to the idea. It's the writers who changed the style of writing first, and they changed the style of writing because they noticed, we've got literature from back here. We've got literature from the Roman Empire. We've got literature from Virgil. We've got literature from Cicero. We've got literature from Seneca. We've got the writers of the late Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire. And then we've got the literature that we're reading now. We've got, and they're all in the language of Latin, but the Latin of 1400 is very different from the Latin of 100. Republican classical Latin is very complex, very sophisticated, very ornate, long sentences and dependent clauses, and they play with declensions and modifiers and prepositional phrases, and they write like Faulkner on a bench. You have a sentence that goes for a page and a half, and you've got to parse all the different parts and clauses. Medieval Latin is the dog bit the man. And maybe an adjective or two. Yeah. So here are some writers in 1400, and they go, you know what? They wrote better than we do. They wrote more complicated. They wrote more sophisticated. It's a real struggle for us to read what Cicero wrote. Cicero is very eloquent in Latin. He's not so eloquent in translation, but he's very eloquent in Latin. And so they go, you know what we ought to do? We ought to revive the style of Latin at its height. We ought to go back to the days of the Roman Republic and the early days of the Roman Empire, the early days of Caesar Augustus in the first century. We ought to revive that way of doing Latin. So everybody speaks Latin. The church used Latin as its official language. The universities, when they get founded about 1000 AD, everything is taught in Latin. All the lectures are in Latin. All the books are in Latin. All the correspondence is in Latin. That's why students could come in to a university in the Middle Ages, and it didn't matter what language they had learned at home from their mother. They had to learn Latin to go to university because Latin was the language of scholarship. So if you studied in Cologne in Germany, or in Bologna in Italy, or in Paris or in Oxford, if you spoke Latin, you could join the conversation. And so everybody learned Latin in order to, if you wanted to be a scholar, you learned Latin. Well, along come these writers in Italy first, and they say, we need to revive the Latin of the ancient world. And you know what? Looking back at the far past, because we're in 1400, and Virgil writes in the days of Caesar Augustus, the first century, that was 1,300 years ago. Between us and them is this long stretch of time that probably should be labeled a middle age, because we're modern. So the Renaissance thinks of itself as modern. We don't call them that anymore. We think of them as Renaissance, maybe early modern, but we think of modern as, post 1500 and really then post Enlightenment. Which brings me to, yes, the moderns. And I've done the same thing that the big wall chart does. I've got one time scale all the way across this. So medieval is 1,000 years. Modern times is only 500. Modern times is, Luther is 1500. Luther's teaching in Wittenberg and nails up the theses in 1517, and the first German Bible, New Testament, is published in 1522. Full Bible in German is published in 1534. It's all early 1500s. By the way, those first Bibles published by Luther, first Bibles printed in anything other than Latin since about 400 AD. And they didn't have any verse numbers. They have chapter numbers, because the chapter numbers had been introduced at the universities in the Middle Ages. So you could at least say, okay, go to the Gospel of John, go to this chapter. Other than that, you'd say, well, go to the Gospel of John, about halfway through, look for this passage. So in the Middle Ages at the university, they added the chapter divisions. They didn't add verse divisions until Stephanus, I'm trying to popularize his name, Stephanus in Geneva in 1559 is the first Bible with verse numbers. Luther's Bible in 1534, and then a big revision in 41, no verse numbers. So modern times. Modern times, we only got, I cheated a little bit. 600 years takes us back to 1400. You want to talk about even numbers, 4,000, really 2,500 BC to 500 AD, medieval 500 AD to 1500 AD, modern 1500 to 2000. Let's talk about a few details. Actually, let's talk about some of the dominant civilization in each time period. There's Egypt. Egypt is a good place to start, because if you read through the historical books of the Old Testament, you'll notice that even in the book of Genesis, Abraham goes to Egypt and encounters a pharaoh. So Egypt actually exists before Israel does. And Egypt and Israel's history then is intertwined for a long time. Egypt exists, we're pretty sure, somewhere between 2,500 and about 2,300, all the way down to the time it's conquered by the Persians. It's the oldest of the ancient civilizations, and very much worth studying. Israel, you can go from Abraham to the exile and the return, to Nehemiah and Esther when they come back and rebuild the temple and then rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. That's also from about 2,400 BC to about 500 BC. So Egypt and Israel make a nice pair to study together. And there are more prophecies about Egypt in the Old Testament than about any other country except Israel. Egypt is mentioned constantly, not just in the book of Genesis and Exodus, but also in the prophetic works. Greece is a little bit of a latecomer. The Egyptians have been going strong for a long time before we get the first records of anything like the Greek city-states. The oldest historical event that the Greeks told themselves was about their war with the city of Troy. And that's probably about 1000 BC, which means it's probably about the time that David is king in Israel. Is when the Greeks build a fleet of 1,000 ships and sail across the Ionian and besiege the city of Troy and eventually destroy it. And then it lasts down to about 300 BC. If we wanted to drop Alexander the Great in here, he comes at the very end of Greek history. The Greek city-states have their own separate historical accounts, but they have a common language and a common culture. And they're eventually unified politically under Alexander. So those are three of the four great civilizations of the ancient world. The fourth one, of course, is Rome. And when David is king in Jerusalem and the Greeks are laying siege to Troy, the Romans don't exist yet. There is no city named Rome. The founding of the city of Rome does not come until 750 BC. So Rome is found traditionally, this is the story the Romans themselves tell, which seems to be kind of semi-legendary. Romulus and Remus, the two brothers, one of whom killed the other in the process of founding the city. That's 753 BC. That's 250 years after David, 250 years after Troy. And that's just the founding of Rome, which at its founding is really nothing more than a little village on the bank of the Tiber River where there were a few hills, the last hills before you get to the coastal plain. By the way, Augustine has a great time talking about and comparing the story in Genesis of Cain and Abel and the story of Romulus and Remus. And I have fun teaching this to my kids, too, because, Cain and Abel is the first fratricide. It's a brother killing a brother. Romulus and Remus are two brothers, one who killed the other out of envy. And Augustine says, yeah, there's some surface parallels, but here's the problem. In Cain and Abel, Cain is the villain. Cain is the bad guy. The murderer is clearly the one who has sinned and is unrighteous and is punished. For the Romans, Romulus killed his brother and was the founder of the city and is celebrated. The Romans make the murderer the hero. City of God, city of man. That's, if you wanted to sum up Augustine's great work, that's where he starts and talks about the difference there. So when Rome collapses, and Rome goes through three phases. So Rome is this little city, this little village, for 250 years, ruled by a succession of kings. And then one of the kings is a notorious tyrant and a ravisher of women and imposing high taxes. And the rape of Lucretia, who's a nobleman's daughter, by the prince, son of the king, leads to the overthrow and expulsion of the kings. So the Roman Republic is founded because of the tyranny of the kings in that first period. And the Roman Republic, about 500 BC. And at that point, it's still a city. Probably only 5,000 or 10,000 people. A city on a river in the center of the Italian peninsula. Over the 500 years of the Republic, from 500 to 0, that city expands. It goes to war with neighboring cities and conquers them and absorbs them. And it goes to war with the southern part of Italy, which actually had been populated by Greek colonies. So all of the south of Italy is actually Greek before it's Roman. And that's why southern Italy has a more Mediterranean culture and flavor than the northern part of Italy. So Rome is eventually, and then Rome reaches across and gets involved in a war with Carthage across the Mediterranean. And Rome eventually expands to where the Mediterranean becomes its lake, and they have provinces all surrounding. And at that point, they move from being a republic where they're electing two consuls who share executive power and serve for terms of 1 year. Every year they hold an election and they pick two different guys to hold executive power. They have a Senate and the consuls. In the last century, before Jesus, they get involved with a bunch of neighboring tribes, and there's some barbarians from the north who are putting pressure on them. And they suddenly discover that they have enemies and wars on two fronts, and they don't have enough money to pay for two armies at the same time. And so a very wealthy, probably sort of like the Elon Musk or the Warren Buffett of the first century BC, It's not Julius Caesar, by the way. It's Marius, who had made himself fabulously wealthy with some campaigns in Greece and Asia Minor, says, I will raise an army and pay all of the expenses and wages for the soldiers, and I will go deal with one of these threats. And the Senate can raise an army and go deal with the other one. And he wins, and the army raised by the Senate wins, but now Marius has an army, and it's not the army of the Republic. It's Marius's army. And Marius winds up being elected consul for 7 consecutive terms. And Rome starts that transition. Marius is the generation before Julius. Julius is actually Marius's nephew. So Julius Caesar does the same thing. He goes and campaigns in Gaul, what is now France. He goes over the Alps and he's sent off. He's 5 or 6 years conquering. Says he conquered 1 million people and 1,000 villages. And the Roman Senate eventually says, yeah, you've been up there enough. We're going to recall you. You need to turn your army over to somebody else. And he's like, well, I have political enemies in Rome. If I turn my army over to somebody else, they're liable to bring me up on charges and not just fine me, they might actually execute me. So he says, I'm not giving up command of my army. He brings his army over the Alps and down through Italy. And his rivals keep sending out legions from Rome to intercept him. And Caesar stands up and gives them a speech, and those legions then fall in with his army. And he takes Rome. And the charge, the reason Caesar is assassinated, is the rumor spreads through Rome that Julius Caesar wants to be king. He is planning to take the title of king. And they had overthrown the last king because he was a tyrant and a wicked ravisher of women. And so if you say, well, this guy is trying to be king, sort of like saying, this guy's going to be Hitler. Somebody's going to take a shot at him. Oh, sorry. Did I get off topic there? Anyway, so that's how the Roman Republic makes a transition to the Roman Empire. The really interesting question about Rome, historically, is not, why did the Roman Empire fall? Lots of books and debates about why did the Roman Empire fall? I don't think that's the interesting question. The interesting question is, why did the Roman Republic fail? Why did it transition from being an elected republic to being a military dictatorship? Because this is the ugly little secret about the Roman Empire. Every single one of the Caesars, every single one of the emperors is a general. It's a military dictatorship. Everybody comes to power with the backing of the army or the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard is the legion in the city of Rome. It's sort of the emperor's personal bodyguard. And of course, the Praetorian Guard gets ideas after a while. They realize they're a real power on their own. And so they start bumping off emperors they don't like. And the worst thing you can do, of course, is if you don't pay the Praetorian Guard on time, you're liable to wind up floating in the Tiber and somebody else is going to be emperor. Sort of be like, not paying the Secret Service's wages. No, I'm not going to go there. History, yes. Well, it doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And that's not original. I'm quoting somebody else. Anyway, so the Republic transitions, and really the greatest day of Rome, the absolute apex of Roman civilization, is in that last century when it's still a republic. When it transitions from a republic to a military dictatorship, it's a sign that it's already slipping. It's already in decline. They had built up such incredible wealth and such incredible power and such incredible territorial conquests that it took 500 years for it to all unravel. But it starts unraveling with Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus because they're military dictators. And it goes from bad to worse. In the second century, the 200s, there's what's called the military anarchy, where they have like 8 emperors in 4 years. Because the Praetorian Guard assassinates people, somebody in one of the provinces starts a rebellion, and there's a war and a battle, and the emperor is killed, and this guy claims to be emperor. When Diocletian abdicated, and I'll get to him when I do the lecture on Constantine, in the 10 years after Diocletian, there was at one point 7 different people simultaneously claiming to be the emperor of Rome. Constantine was one of them. And this always blows my kids' mind, blew my mind when I first realized it. Constantine is declared emperor by his troops. He's got the backing of an army because his father had been a general, and he was with his father when his father died, and the troops immediately proclaimed him as the emperor. His father had the title. There were only 4 emperors then. His father had the title. They proclaimed him emperor, and that occurred in York, England. Constantine is declared emperor in York. And he winds up defeating all 6 of his rivals and being, for the first time in quite a while, the single sole emperor of the whole empire from east to west. But he starts out in York. Anyway, okay, so the Roman Empire collapses, kind of fades away. Here's a different picture of that same period of time, ancient history, and you see the major figures: Egypt, Greece, Rome. What I've tried to do here is copy the style of the Walk Through Western History and show you by the sort of vertical expansion the territorial size of each civilization. So Egypt and Israel, I don't have a block for Israel, but here's Abraham, Joseph, the Exodus, Judges, Samuel, Saul, David, Solomon. Samuel's the last judge, Saul's the first king, David and Solomon. There are only 3 kings of the United Kingdom: Saul, David, Solomon, and then it divides. And then what wipes out the northern 10 tribes is the Persians, and then the Babylonians, who are then also conquered by the Persians, take out the southern tribes. So here's the exile. This little line up here is the exile and return. Here's the expansion of the Persian Empire. Here's Greece. Here's the Trojan War. Here's Pericles and Civil War. And then Alexander, that spike that you saw on that, I've got right here coming in, because he conquers the Persian Empire. He conquers Israel too. Alexander shows up in Jerusalem. A very interesting incident there. When Alexander and his army show up outside Jerusalem, the scribes and the Pharisees come out, and they read Alexander the prophecies from the book of Daniel. And Alexander goes, "Oh, that's pretty good stuff." And he left the Jews in control of their own territory, appointed a governor and absorbed them, but he had a very favorable view of the Jews ever after. Unfortunately, he died at 30. And then here's Rome. Here's the period where it ruled by kings. Here's the Republic, rapid expansion. Here's the empire. I'm not really showing the decline, but by 500 AD, Rome is a hollowed out shell. And the migrating German tribes weren't really trying to conquer it. They were homeless. They were being pushed by the Mongols. They were being pushed by Asiatic warriors who were raiding their villages and burning their crops, and they were looking for a safe place to live. They had abandoned their homes because they were tired of being attacked and the Huns raping, pillaging, and burning. And so they were going, they don't cross the Danube. They raid and burn our villages. They take all of our crops and our horse, and they take off slaves, but they don't cross the Danube. They don't, for some reason, want to tangle with the Romans. Let's move over the river and settle there. And so they migrate, 100,000 Germanic warriors with their families. They don't have a homeland that they're trying to add territory to. They have left their homeland. They cross the Danube into the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire just kind of freaks out and doesn't know what to do and collapses because it was a shell. They had actually, for a century or more, they'd been hiring German mercenaries to fill out the ranks of their soldiers. So now you have German mercenaries who are under the command of a Roman general being told to attack and fight German soldiers who've just crossed the Danube, and they go, nah, not going to do it. And so the last Roman emperor dies in 478, and a German king, Theodoric, takes over Italy. Now, the Roman Empire does continue in Constantinople, but it is a longer period of decay. The Eastern Empire, the Greek-speaking part of the Roman world, manages to hold out for a long time. until they have two body blows. They have, well, more than that. The Arabs, and then the Crusaders, who sacked Constantinople at one point, and then the Turks. And the Turks eventually take Constantinople in 1453. There's a Roman emperor in Constantinople until 1453. Okay, I want to leave a little bit of time here, so let's talk about the Middle Ages. Let's get the bigger one. There we go. So I've just, for brevity, focusing on 5 different streams, 5 different provinces of the Roman Empire. England had been part of the Roman Empire. France had been part of the Roman Empire. Germany, parts of it, had been absorbed in the Roman Empire. Italy, of course, and Spain, part of the Roman Empire. They're all provinces, and you see it's a little busier and a little more confused. The English, it's not always an advantage to be an island. It's not always an advantage to be an island. If you're an island and you don't have a navy and you don't have a very good militia, anybody with a boat can take you over, and they do. They are raided and conquered by the Saxons and the Danes and the Normans and the Danes again. 1066 is not the first time that England was conquered. It's the last time England was conquered. Before that, it had been attacked, invaded, conquered, sacked a bunch of times. Well, eventually we get Alfred, here's William, who's really only a generation or so down from the Danes who had settled in France. Normandy is named for the Norsemen. So William the Conqueror is really the descendant of Rollo the Viking. So when he conquers England, he's like, well, yeah, my great-grandfather conquered England. I'll give it a try. And succeeds. And then down to 100 Years' War of the Roses. France starts out wanting to be the inheritor of the Roman Empire. You have Charlemagne, who controls all of France, all of Germany, most of northern Italy, down to and including Rome. He's crowned emperor in Rome. And every German emperor after that wanted that tradition to continue. But it pretty quickly splits. The Ottonians. Actually, Charlemagne's empire is divided into West Francia and East Francia. That's where we get France, the Franks. So West Francia becomes France. East Francia becomes Germany. By the way, you know where Charlemagne is buried? His tomb is still located. You can visit. But his capital city, if you read most history textbooks, this is one of the reasons I hate the textbooks. If you read most textbooks, they'll talk about Charlemagne's capital in the little village, the little Frankish village of Aix-la-Chapelle. And that's true. That's what it was called for a long time. But it's not in France. It's in Germany. And its name is Aachen. It's where Charlemagne's church and throne and tomb are, in Aachen, Germany. The Germans refer to him as Karl the Great. Yeah. Okay. Italy, Lombards, that's a Germanic tribe. Northern Italian cities, the Pope, Rome and Central Italy. In the south, the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily. Italy as a country is not reunited until 100 years after the founding of the United States of America. Italy is a much more recent innovation politically than we are. Italy is reunified in the 1850s, 60s, and early 70s. That's as long as its united political history is. Before that, they had a common language, sort of, and a common culture, but politically shattered, and they're often at war with each other. The Italian city-states fight war after war after war with each other, and the Kingdom of Naples will invade and attack Rome, and Milan will attack Venice, and Venice and Milan will team up and attack Florence. It's only 1870 when Italy is united politically. Spain has a separate history because first of all, it's conquered by Germanic tribes. And then it's conquered by Arab armies in 700 AD, all the way up to the Pyrenees. And the next 500 or 600 years is what the Spanish refer to as the Reconquista. They have to reconquer all of Spain from the Arabs. They fight battle after battle after battle for century after century after century to reconquer territory from the Arabs. Most of Spain was controlled by the Arabs, the Caliphate, for most of the Middle Ages. You know when the last Arab city was reconquered by the Spanish kings? Cordoba, 1492. Now you have another reason to remember that date. That's the reason Ferdinand and Isabella could send ships across the Atlantic. It's like, we've won the war. We've won the centuries-long war. What are we going to do now with our soldiers and our fleet? Well, we can spare 3 ships. They're going to fall off the edge of the earth, but we'll send 3 ships out there. Anyway, all right. I swore I was going to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. Let's talk about the modern world. Same 5 countries. Civil War, Elizabeth I, James I, Civil War, the Glorious Revolution. There's another revolution, and then here's us. Here's us. We come out of, there's obviously multiple lines of migration to North America, and there's us. And then there's our Civil War, which is like, the English are used to doing this. There's a civil war, there's a civil war, there's revolution, there's a civil war. We think of our experience as unique. Not really. The French have a different history. They go through a revolution, and then here's the great big spike in history. This is interesting. This looks like Alexander. Napoleon. Napoleon conquers all the way down into Spain. And of course, coming off of Spain are the colonies in the New World. Here's Italy, of course, the Papal States, and here's Italy getting founded. So we're started here, and Italy started here. And you can tell my map is out of date because I had West and East Germany for a while, and then we got them back together. Oh. All right. I have just about used up my time. So questions. Does that give you a big picture? Do you feel like you understand how we got where we are now? There really is a stream. There really are connections from the ancient world directly to us. And I might just mention at this point, I talked about the Renaissance and the revival of languages, the revival of classical Latin. That Renaissance continues then with a revival of ancient Greek and a revival of Hebrew. That's the work of the Renaissance. Luther is a Renaissance humanist. Luther taps into that literary movement. He's very, very skilled and eloquent in Latin and in Greek and in Hebrew. And when you get to the accomplishments of the Renaissance, they're language, they are in philosophy, they are in theology because the reformers are really coming out of the Renaissance. They're in architecture and art. In politics, there's a very interesting phenomenon about reviving the political structures of the ancient world. Everybody knew the story of the Roman Republic and how it failed. And this is not an original contention with me, but it's one, as soon as I heard it, it immediately resonated, and I have now become convinced. The American Revolution is an accomplishment of the Renaissance. The American Revolution is very self-consciously, the founding fathers are very self-consciously trying to revive the Roman Republic. They use it as their model. They have read Cicero and the other Roman authors. They adopt even the terminology of the Roman Republic. So we like to think of ourselves as on, the cutting edge of history and leading the rest of the world. In 1776, we were not the cutting edge leading history and culture in the world. We were actually way behind what was going on in Europe. Think about the difference between California and Tennessee. Founding fathers were like Tennessee, more culturally conservative, less wild, less progressive, and they were looking back and going, okay, if we're not going to have a king, what form of government might work? Where would we find models? Greek city-states? We got Alexander to deal with, and they fought wars with each other. Roman Republic? Yeah, but we got to make sure it doesn't turn into a military dictatorship. By the way, initially, their idea was no standing army. And the reason for that was they knew their history. So the American Republic, we're not leading world cultural thought and developments, we're a backwater. We're still tagging along with the Renaissance, going, let's look back at the ancient world and see what we can salvage and revive. The French Revolution is a completely different phenomenon. It is not trying to revive anything. It's trying to tear down everything ancient. So the French Revolution, the American Revolution have almost nothing in common with each other than Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson. But the ideas are oriented completely different. So, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to monopolize the Q&A. And the results are very different, yeah. The French are still trying to figure out how to come up with a political structure that works. Did you know they had a coup d'etat in the 1950s? De Gaulle was a military dictator for a while. We're on like the sixth republic since 1812. They haven't quite figured out how to make the thing work.
Who is that you're talking about?
The French. Well, yeah, each republic has a different constitution. And they're talking about having to rewrite it because the current turmoil has populist political parties with lots of support and left-wing parties that, manage to sort of game the election that they just held so that they have a majority in the parliament, but they're popular only in Paris. And so the rest of France is like, we got to change the game somehow.
The big cities.
Yeah, the big cities.
Do you think this, especially with my generation and younger, the huge gap we have with understanding ancient history is the reason why all of these young people have been swooped up in the Palestinian history versus Israel and all of this stuff? Because it seems like everybody my age is an expert on that now, and it's something I've ever heard before.
Yeah.
But I mean, how do you cover that in high school? I mean, obviously you went over all this in an hour, but I mean, everything in detail. Like, how do you do that at Schaeffer in 4 years?
We spend a full year on the ancient world, and then a year on the Middle Ages, the Renaissance and Reformation, a year on early modern, which is basically from Queen Elizabeth to Abraham Lincoln. So we do get the French Revolution at the end of the third year. And then we go from the American Civil War down to modern times in year 4. The seniors start with Reconstruction. We actually do the Civil War at the end of year 3. And I think something like that is what you have to do. You have to spend more time. And you have to spend more time understanding how we got to where we are and what the roots and the predecessors are, or you won't understand why we have some of the conflicts we have now. Not understanding the history now is crippling us.
They don't teach the kids what they need to know.
The great substitutions.
And they don't care about social studies or science on any of the tests. It's only writing and math.
Yeah. And it's multiple choice and reading comprehension.
Exactly.
And I'm sorry, that's because the model of education that dominates in the American schools of education is we need to prepare people for their careers. And that's an impoverished, they're not really doing such a great job at that. But that's a very impoverished view of what education ought to do. Education ought to prepare you to think. It ought to prepare you for life. It ought to prepare you to be a citizen. It ought to prepare you to be able to discern between fake news and real news. It ought to prepare you to understand truth and beauty and goodness. And we just want to pretend, we can't agree on what truth and beauty and goodness are, so we're not going to talk about it. You'll pardon me, I know I'm in the church sanctuary, but everybody's adopted Voltaire's view of history, which is history is just one damn thing after another. And actually, I could say that with a straight face because it's kind of a theological observation. If you don't have a vision of what education should be about, building the character of young people, teaching them virtue, helping them to appreciate beauty, giving them a sense of awe and wonder about the natural world and about the great things that have been accomplished over the centuries. If you don't give them that, if you just say, well, you know, there's a class you should take here because it'll help you get out of flipping burgers at McDonald's. It's like, if that's all your education is for, it's no wonder that, you know, the political discourse that we have going on right now is so bizarre. It's like, which party can give me more stuff?
There's a shift in that mindset in homeschooling as well, where homeschooling, there's a group moving where they just want to raise their kids to be tradesmen and only educate them according to their interests and build their skills. And they get shafted when it comes to history and literature and art because, oh, well, you know, they're really interested in architecture and they're really interested in this, so we're only going to, you know, prioritize these things. And it's like you're doing the same thing that the public school is doing. You're just preparing a factory worker.
Right. Well, and government-run factory schools. John Gatto called them that. They're government-run factory model schools, churning out obedient workers who will be, if drafted, obedient soldiers. It's a Prussian model, you know. And the American public education system is modeled on the compulsory education of the state of Prussia in the early 1800s. Produce obedient soldiers and obedient citizens who will follow orders and won't go on strike. And that's all you need to do. And you don't need to educate. If you put crazy ideas in their head, then, you know, they'll start thinking on their own, and we can't control them. Well, I'm sorry. I want to train kids who can't be controlled. I want to train kids who will think for themselves. And that's a tall order these days, because it's hard. It takes work. Learning all of this and reading some of the literature, studying some of the art. One of the reasons why we do 3 classes on history, literature, and art is there's a very influential cultural essayist in the 1800s in England, Ruskin. Not very much known anymore, but Ruskin wrote an essay, and he said every culture, every great country has written their history in 3 books. The book of their deeds, the book of their words, and the book of their art. And of the 3, the book of their art is the truest. So if you want to understand a culture that's not your own, and learning a culture that's not your own is extremely valuable, you don't just study their deeds. That's the deathly dull history textbooks. You need to study their words. You need to read their literature to understand them. And you really won't understand them unless you also study their art. And the art will help you understand the literature will help you understand the deeds. The deeds, in turn, are inspired by the art and the literature. I mean, you need all 3. And I think it's biblical. In fact, I think the model for doing history this way is the way the Bible records history. The Bible is not a history textbook. The Bible is not a Western Civ boiled down, dull textbook. The Bible is a series of biographies. The Bible gives you the story of people, and kids love them. It's the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Joshua and Samuel. Jumping over the judges, because Samson's not a great model for the kids, but you want to study him. He's a negative example. The stories of Samuel and Saul and David and Solomon, kids resonate with those stories. Kids like those. Their biography is God knew what he was doing when he put those stories together and inspired those writers. These are the things that we're supposed to be teaching our children, is the Old Testament, the stories from the Old Testament. It's not the advanced course for people who are Christians and want to go on for the master's degree. The Old Testament is what you teach children. You tell them the stories of those people, all the way down through Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther.
One observation, it's not my observation, I think it's worth saying out loud. The old adage that history books are written by the victors, you know, and so when you go and you read the writings of these ancient civilizations, yes, it is typically the victors that have the books that survive, and they tend to exaggerate their glories, and they tend to kind of cover up their foibles, you know, and the bad things, but there's become a whole shift in the last few generations of want to write history, and it's revisionist. It's to go back. You write a history to support whatever your ideology is. Because we can't really know what went on. History is so subjective. So why not write it to support your ideology? And so a lot of what we get now as history is just
Pseudo.
pseudo. It's
Yeah.
pseudo history to support whatever ideology happens to be your favorite.
Yeah.
The favorite of the author.
Yeah.
You know, I saw, you said something interesting that I kind of see a little bit of a parallel here when you talked about the Middle Ages. Latin was see Jane run, effectively, as opposed to the, well, there's a little bit of that now. Go back and read the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or any of the letters that any of the founding fathers wrote,
Yeah.
and read that stuff, and then read some of the stuff that gets written today, and there's a huge difference. That's why people don't even understand some of the stuff that
Or
was
even
written.
some of the letters of Civil War soldiers,
Yeah.
how literate they were compared to.
It's the language is completely different.
Yeah.
Completely different.
Yeah. It's because we don't give kids enough great literature to read. We give them little snippets and extracts, and with the standardized test, we're just training them on comprehension. So we give them a paragraph with a few questions and a paragraph with a few questions. And the Common Core standards will actually state explicitly, it doesn't matter what the text is. You're just teaching them reading comprehension, so we can throw out all the standard text, the whole canon of Western literature, all the great books. We don't have to study them. We just give them some sample paragraphs, and they could be anything. Sample paragraphs, multiple choice questions, sample paragraphs, multiple choice questions, and they'll score high on a reading comprehension standardized test, and the teachers will get patted on the back. Because that's the way we have set the structure up. Standardized testing is a curse. Sorry.
Get rid of the unions. Get rid of the
Well, yeah. Government-run factory model schools, I'm not sure it can be salvaged. I'm not sure, and it's an experiment. It's an experiment that we only started in 1900. We have experimented with a system of education for about 120 years, and I pronounce the experiment a failure.
So throw it out. And
Well, I had this great seventh grade world history textbook I was given to teach, and it had 3 chapters on Islam and 1 chapter on the Renaissance. That was my world history textbook for 7th grade.
I must have gotten lucky because in high school, I had 1 year of U.S. history, 1 semester, two semesters. And I also had 2 semesters of world history, and they were not taught by coaches. Actually, one of them was taught by our neighbor down the road. She was the U.S. history teacher. And then I knew the guy that was our world history teacher, too. And, I mean, it basically covered, well, it wasn't even called world history. It was called Western civilization.
Yes.
And it started
Where
with
was that?
Hmm?
Where was that?
Bentonville, Arkansas. And I graduated in 1977, so this would have been in 75, 76, 77, around that time.
Well, you guys have been very, very patient, and I am really, really tickled that you came. We're going to do this again next month. Instead of being just Western Civ, though, I'm going to do the history of the church. And I'm going to focus on the history of the church in 8 Bibles. So we'll talk about from the close of the New Testament through modern times, through at least the 1600s. And it's going to be show and tell. I'm going to bring you some things to look at. I've got a piece of papyrus and a piece of vellum, and we'll have a little fun looking at some older Bible. I've got facsimiles of some older Bible. I have a facsimile that my kids have given me. My kids gave me a facsimile of Luther's Bible, the 1534, and my wife gave me a facsimile of the Book of Kells, which is the 4 Gospels, done by a scribe, written out by hand in about 700 AD. So, all right. Thank you so much.